CORP2020. I'm here today on the campus of Boston College with Professor Juliet Schor. Professor Schor is an economist who now teaches in the sociology department here. She stepped outside the box a long time ago and has written thoughtful critiques of economic growth, consumption, and our general economy. Professor Schor, it's great to be here with you today.
Pleasure to be here with you.
We share your sense of urgency about the environmental crises that anyone who's listening knows are going to become more serious in the coming years. Do you think that the best lever to adjust this system is in the consumption side or the production side or some other angle?
One thing that's pretty clear to me is that voluntary efforts on the part of either corporations or households can't be more than a first step. They're part of what get us into a situation where we can then put in place norms, regulations, standards, legislation, new tax policy, and so forth. All of those things are going to be necessary.
You've touched on a number of themes of CORP2020. You mentioned taxation. We see moving taxation from good things like income to bad things like pollution or resource extraction as key. And before that even happens, we have to address subsidies.
Absolutely, getting rid of subsidies for carbon-based energy sources is essential. I don't think there's any question about that. Taxation has to be a part of shifting to a new kind of resource use pattern. But the enthusiasm for taking off taxes on labor and for increasing taxes on resources needs to be tempered a little bit by thinking through all of the system effects of reducing the amount of taxation on labor. Because if, as many economists think, it will lead to big increases in labor supply, then you have other issues.
We have a key plank of change that we call accounting for externalities, which is basically measuring the environmental and social impacts of companies and requiring them to disclose it. And then it's a policy decision what you do with that information, but we at least need to get that information out there available to investors and consumers right now. Do you think that this has a potential for changing the business as usual?
I do think that measurement is really important to make change. And I think particularly in institutions that are very measurement-oriented like corporations, starting to take these issues seriously by measuring them seriously can provide a lot of momentum for change. So I think it's important, and I think that we can think back on the history of indicators and see that new indicators typically bring with them system change. So measurement can't do it alone. It's one part of a larger set of policies and changes. I think it's a necessary but not sufficient change to achieve true sustainability.
We have a piece in the upcoming CORP2020 book where we explain this demand for more equitable pay in companies as an expression of people wanting to see the corporations that make their products as having goals more aligned with their own goals that we value in the civil society. Do you see this as a viable future for a future form of a corporation, to have goals aligned with those of society? Or do you think that there will always be this tension between shareholders, let's say, and management?
Well, I think if we don't get corporations' goals aligned with society, one or the other of those entities is going to ultimately be unsustainable, either corporations or society.
You take a really interesting stance in arguing that a shorter work week would move us towards a more sustainable economy? You talked about the 21-hour work week, which was proposed by the New Economics Foundation. You want to say a few points about why you see that to be a key move?
Reductions in working time are absolutely essential for achieving sustainability in the wealthy countries. And that's not something that I think most people understand yet, but they will come to understand it as they start to think through the numbers associated with required carbon emissions and decarbonization rates and so forth. This happened very quickly in the UK after they passed a climate change law in 2007, which mandated 60% reductions in emissions by 2050. Not enough. I think they understood not too long after passing that bill that they were going to have to go to 80 or 90%. But very quickly, when they started to do the math and looking at the hard targets of carbon reduction, they understood that continued growth, particularly in some of their more intensive sectors, wouldn't be compatible with meeting those targets with any kind of realistic assumptions about rates of decarbonization. So once we realize we're going to have to do something about the expanding scale of the economy, then you ask the question, well, how can we do that? We are an economy that is based on growth. Is it even feasible to have an advanced capitalist economy that's not growing as rapidly as possible? When you think about that a little bit more, you realize the answer is yes. We have rich economies that grow at relatively slow rates. The wealthy economies don't tend to grow all that fast. And you can see then that the key issue with slowing down rates of growth is unemployment. And how do you keep your population employed if you're growing at 1% a year, or maybe if you're not growing at all? And the obvious answer to that is that you reduce hours of work, that you take your productivity growth, which is being generated through investment and technical change and so forth, particularly if you're shifting to a new energy technology. You're going to expect a lot of nice productivity growth as a result of that. You take that productivity growth, instead of giving it to people in the form of more income, which they can then go out and spend on more goods, you give them more free time, so that over time people's incomes stay roughly stable and their hours of work go down. This is what the Netherlands did from about 1980 until the late 1990s. They had a big unemployment problem. They dealt with it by progressive reductions in hours of work. They ended up with the highest labor productivity in Europe, an extremely successful economy.
I think it's a really intriguing idea. I imagine one of the critiques that you often hear is that many Americans are already sort of on the line of not being able to afford what they need, and even more so in other countries. How would you respond to that?
Moving to a more equal society in terms of hours and reducing average hours of work will actually help people at the low end a lot in two ways. One of the reasons that we have so many people who are having difficulty making ends meet is that many of them can't get enough hours, so they are underemployed. We've got 25 million people in this country. We've got 25 million people in the United States who are either unemployed or underemployed, meaning they have some hours of work but not enough. So more equitable distribution of hours, which would be one of the things that would happen with shorter hours, would actually boost those incomes. The other part of this that's important to understand is over the long run, if hours of work are reduced, then those surpluses in the labor market are reduced, and it will allow workers to capture more of their own productivity growth. What's happened for many years now is that workers have been unable to capture their productivity growth, and so it's all going into capital share. So you have a falling labor share. People are, because of the weaknesses in the labor market from the point of view of workers. So shorter hours actually turn out to be something that's very good for people at the bottom of the income distribution.
Turning to a slightly different topic, another of the drivers of this business as usual economy is advertising. Advertising, we believe, is one of the big reasons that people turn their wants into needs and then need to go out and buy those things. In order to address advertising, to make it more accountable, more ethical, who do you think bears the responsibility or the ability to change that system? Would you say it's the companies to make voluntary changes? Is it consumers to learn how to see through some advertisements? Ad agencies to take on more ethics in their work? Or some other actors?
My own view is that the demand for consumer goods is driven much more by social processes which are there with or without advertising. And in societies which have a lot of inequality, and those are societies like the UK, the United States, for example, there's a lot of consumption competition that comes through that inequality. And people need to consume in order to keep up. They need to consume in a world where the norms of what it means to be middle class are rising. And they're rising not just because of advertising. Advertisers take advantage of those dynamics. But my own view is that if advertising disappeared tomorrow, we would still be faced with this problem that you are identifying, which is that our consumption dynamics are not sustainable. Having been inside advertising agencies, I can tell you that of all corporations I have ever been exposed to, they are the most amoral entities on the earth. As a discipline or as a field, advertisers have failed to develop any kind of set of ethics, and you've got to look to the client companies. They've got to force the advertisers into it. Client companies have a lot more ethics than advertising.
Given a very thorough and plausible view of what the future economy could look like in a more sustainable path, just as a way of closing, how do you see the corporation fitting into that view?
The survival of human civilization depends on corporations coming to understand that the path that we are on is not just unsustainable, but very dangerous.
That's great. Well, Professor Schor, it's been an honor talking with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.